study your word, to discover your will. Guide our reading, our listening, and our thinking, so that your message, which is old, may be forever new in our hearts. Father, we ask for your special blessing on those on our prayer list, especially those people we've just been mentioning. Their situations are different, their circumstances are different, but we ask for your help, for your assistance, for your strengthening in days of weakness, for your recovery for days of sickness, and we ask for your overall care for each one of them. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, if you would turn to Acts chapter 17, I want to just touch on something that came up as a question last time, or actually it might have been the time before, but I just want to make a general point, and it's not entirely related. It sort of came up in the 16th chapter. One of the questions that you may hear, and you hear from a lot of people who are either atheists or agnostics, and it's often a criticism leveled at the church. They say, well, why did the early church not do anything about things like slavery and other social evils? Now, at the time of Paul, and of course, as you know, for hundreds of years afterwards, slavery, which we, of course, naturally find repugnant, was a widely accepted norm in society. That's what it was. You had slaves, and there were many, many, many slaves. So as the church was starting, because the church was such a tiny minority, it would have been impossible for the church to change society over that time. They were just a tiny percentage. But one thing I will say to you is that even a casual look at social history or church history, you will see, and this is something that we're not given credit for, that the critics of the church will say, oh, well, what about the Crusades? What about the violence? Isn't religion the cause of all the trouble in the world and all this kind of thing? And you'll hear that. It's an often repeated argument, usually by people who have done no research whatsoever. And the purpose of the church was to change society one person at a time. But having said that, the church was behind some great social movements. The Methodist Church, the early Methodists, were tremendously strong, and they made big influences, especially in Britain. It was often said that the early Methodists, under John and Charles Wesley and George Whitefield, they prevented Britain going the way of revolutionary France. You remember the bloodshed in France, and they were chopping off the heads of the aristocrats and all that kind of thing. A lot of real horrors in that revolution. And if you think about the things that the church has been at the forefront, where did orphanages come from? From the church. Where were the first hospitals? The church began the first hospitals. Where were the first hospices? Not just hospitals taking care of the sick, but hospices giving comfort and succor to the dying. Again, that was a church. Church motivation moved all of this. What was the first move to have nationwide schools and education? The church. What were the oldest universities in this country? They're all Christian-based universities intended to train and educate and train clergy. What were the first movements in child laws in the Victorian era? I mean, if you read some of the Victorian literature, like the Water Babies and stories like that, you'll discover this was a time when they were still putting children up chimneys to clean them. You had children working in factories, working under these looms, getting injured, getting killed. It was considered just an everyday occurrence. It was the church that pressed for child labor laws. And for instance, it was the church that that pushed for penal reform, how you dealt with prisoners, the conditions in prisons, and so on. First person in that, the first person at the forefront of prison reform was Howard, the Reverend John Howard. He was a Congregational minister in the middle of England. And the strongest prison reform movement in Britain was the Howard League for Prison Reform. You can look it up, you can Google it. And he was a minister in the 1700s. So all of these big social movements, all of these things to bring society to be a more caring, compassionate people were originated from the church. Does anyone have any questions? No? Okay. Well, I wanted to make that point because you will often hear very negative things about the church, and you very seldom hear say, well, where do you think hospitals came from? Where do you think hospices originated? Where do you think education started? Started with the church. And that was one of the, if you think about the early church, that was one of the great influences the church had in the Greek and Roman world. The Roman world was a very cruel world. It was all about power. It was all about might. It was all about, strength and the no time for the weak and all that kind of thing. They went to the wall. If you look at the early church, you discover that one of the greatest influences is that they saw when there was a disaster in a country, when there was a flood, when there was an earthquake, when there was a volcano erupted, while ordinary people were rushing out of the city, Christians were rushing in to bring succor to the wounded, to those who were dying, and trying to help in really tragic situations. It made an influence because these people who were not believers said, why do these people do this? Why do they act like this? The rest of us are getting out of the way. We want nothing to do with it. But it began to have a great influence. And even Roman writers, historians, Tacitus, and people like that talk about what the church did, what these Christians did in the early days. Made a big influence. Okay, lecture over. Let's turn to Acts 17. Now, just to recap, we saw Paul in Philippi. He and Silas had come to Philippi, and they were preaching and teaching. You remember that Paul's pattern is to go to the local synagogue. Turns out in Philippi there wasn't one, so they met with a group of women who were meeting by the river for prayer and worship and so on, and Paul begins his ministry in Philippi. Now, he's really harshly treated in Philippi. He's arrested, he's put in prison, he's beaten, his back is bleeding. He and Silas are in the prison cell. And yet, this is the letter. If you read Paul's letter to the Philippians, it is the most affectionate letter that Paul writes. He has this church in Philippi have a special place in his heart. And every minister has a special affection for a particular church he has ministered in. And if he's wise, he will tell the congregation that it's the one he's in right now. If he's a dummy, he'll say something else. But Paul had a real affection for the people of Philippi. You know, every time he thought of them, he smiled. And it's one of the prison letters. Remember, there's very little at this point that Paul is glad about when he's writing the letters that are the prison epistles. But he writes to Philippi, and he just you can see as he dictates and as the words go down on the parchment, Paul is seeing the different faces of the different people, and he's smiling. It's a church that meant a lot to him, though he was badly treated in the city. Now, Paul and Silas then decide to move on, and we pick it up at 17 verse 1. When they passed through Annapolis and Alaponia, they came to Thessalonica, and there was a Jewish synagogue. As his custom was, Paul went into the synagogue on 3 Sabbath days, and he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that the Christ had to suffer and rise from the dead. This Jesus I am proclaiming to you is the Christ, he said. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks, and not a few prominent women. Now, you can see that Paul uses a different method. When he goes to the synagogue, he's a scholar of the Hebrew Scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and he's able to take them to different passages. He's able to remind them of the stories of Israel, of the progress of Israel, of the personalities in Israel, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and all David and all the rest. And so he guides them through, and he's able to use that to say to them, now look, all of our history was preparing us for the day when God would send his Messiah. Every generation looked forward and said, I wonder will I be alive when the Messiah comes? There was always that thing that he might come tomorrow. And so Paul is making his way on this journey, and it mentions a few places, verse 1, in passing, and they're just on the way, and they come to Thessalonica. Now, thanks to your kindness, I have been to Thessalonica. It's a huge natural harbor. It's really enormous. And on the Sunday, the first Sunday we were there was a boat trip on the harbor planned, but we went to the worship service in the center of Thessalonica, and then we were supposed to go on this boat trip, which would take us around this huge harbor. But it turned out it was a wet day, and it was kind of a windy day, and the powers that be decided that it wouldn't be a good day to go on the boat trip, and we never got to go another day. But it's an enormous harbor, and right in the center of the harbor, along the side, is a huge equestrian statue of Alexander the Great. There he is on his horse, looking for all the world like a conqueror. So, what Paul and Silas would be traveling on as they made this journey, 2 centuries before Jesus, the Romans had built a 700-mile-long road. It was 20 feet wide, it was paved, and it stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Adriatic. 700 miles. And it was an incredible feat. They moved on from Philippi to Annapolis. Experts tell us that's about 35 miles. Then they went another 30 miles going through Apollonia. They probably stayed a night in each of these places. There's nothing recorded about what Paul did or what Paul said in these smaller towns. He had his vision focused on Thessalonica. And then from Apollonia, you travel on about 33 miles to Thessalonica. And think about, we've been thinking about Paul's suffering, and his back is bleeding, and he's really had a rough time. He and Silas have walked 100 miles in just about a week, or a little over a week. It's a lot of walking, it's a lot of stress. Now, Dr. Luke, remember we were looking at the we passages in the text, remember? And that tells us that Luke goes from being the recorder of the events to an eyewitness of the events. There are 3 we sections in the Acts of the Apostles. And they are written when Luke joins them. But at this moment, we've gone back to the third person, and Luke is no longer with them. And he seems to have stayed in Philippi. Ancient tradition is he was from Philippi. He had a family there, maybe a medical practice there, and so on. And it's fair to say, we can assume that Dr. Luke does not see Paul again until the 3rd missionary journey. And we pick that up in Acts chapter 20. And that's when the second group of the we passages begins. Now, you can see that it is definitely Paul's pattern to go to the synagogue first, to go on the Sabbath day, to offer himself to the leader of the synagogue and to say, will you allow me to speak? And of course, when Paul has the opportunity to speak, he's only got one subject, and that is Jesus Christ. And you see, as you go through the Acts of the Apostles, you see how constant, how steady Paul is in this pattern of how he presents. He presents to the Jews first, then he goes to the marketplace, to the agora, and he speaks in the open air. He gathers a crowd. He talks to the Greeks and the Romans, and he presents to them Jesus, not as a Jewish God, but as a Savior of the world. But if you look at it, he does this in Thessalonica, that's in chapter 17. He does this same pattern, going to the synagogue first in Athens in 17. He does it in Corinth, chapter 18. He does it in Ephesus, chapter 18. He does it in Troas, chapter 20. And he does it in Caesarea, chapter 24, as he waits to be transported by boat to Rome. So this is a very constant pattern of Paul's life. You go to the synagogue, you talk to your fellow Jews, you try and persuade them, and you can see in those opening verses that some were persuaded. Look at verse 4. Some of the Jews were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks and not a few prominent women. Randy, yes. Well, they were, it's fair to say, when it talks about God-fearing Greeks, it means that they were very interested in the God of the Hebrews. And what I was going on to say was, there was, for some reason, there was a great feeling in the world at that time that there was a Messiah coming who would be relevant to Greeks and Romans, to Jews and Gentiles, to everybody. Now, we don't know where this originated. One of the amusing things is, history records for us that the Emperor Caligula, who, as you know, was madder than a junkyard dog, Caligula thought he was the one. He thought he was the one that was going to unite the whole world, and he was going to be worshipped as a god. Now, up to Caligula, what happened with Roman emperors was that they all wished to be declared gods after they died. Julius Caesar did, Augustus did, Tiberius did. Then next in line is Caligula. Well, that wasn't good enough for Caligula. He wanted to be worshipped as a god while he was alive. And at one point in his relatively short time as Caesar, he declared to all his followers that he had been transformed into a god, and didn't they notice the difference? Now, you could imagine if you were one of his courtiers or one of his advisors, you were going to heartily agree, of course I see the difference. You look like a god. Your face is shining like the sun. They told him all this kind of nonsense because, believe it or not, they wanted to live. So at this time, there was this very widespread opinion that there was coming someone special who would be a Messiah, not a Jewish Messiah, but a worldwide Messiah. Now, these God-fearing Greeks were people who were very interested. What happened was they started to learn about the Hebrew faith. They started to learn about Jehovah God. And if so moved, they then approached the synagogue and they became converts. And they had to go through a certain process. They had to be baptized into the Jew. The extraordinary thing is the Jews didn't have a practice of baptism. They had a practice which wasn't the same, but it was you went through cleansing tanks when you came to the temple. You washed. Now that was more about hygiene than it was about theology. But when outsiders said, well, I want to be a follower of Jehovah God, they had a process to go through. Now, these people are either somewhere along that journey. They're somewhere along that path. They're beginning to say, there's something attractive. I'm drawn to this God that the Jews worship. And they were the kind of people that we're told about that joined with Paul and said, well, now, we believe in this Jesus. And so on, as it tells us in verse 4. Now, you notice it was a large number. Look at verse 4 again. A large number of God-fearing Jews and not a few prominent women. Are you surprised by that phrase? Because the one thing in that age was that most women were not what? They were not prominent, right? They were second rate. It was a male-dominated society. They made all the decisions. They were in charge. Women came along, on that kind of thing. They were not significant. They didn't hold public office, and so on. So the idea that these were prominent women is very striking. Don't miss it. Don't miss the significance. And the other thing to say, who is the author of the Acts of the Apostles? Luke, Dr. Luke. If you read Luke's gospel, he gives far more, what would you call it, prominence, highlights, attention, focus on women than any other gospel. Theologians call Luke the gospel of women, because you meet more women in Luke's gospel. They're shown in a very positive light. They're people of great, strong faith. Luke is very much at the forefront of showing how important women were in the ministry of Jesus and how important they were in the early faith. And this is just an aside. This is just put in there, but don't skip over it. He's making this point. I mean, he could have stopped the sentence at saying, as did a large number of God-fearing Greeks, full stop. And you wouldn't have known whether they were men or women or what the deal was. He goes on to make the important point, and not a few prominent women. Remember in the last chapter we met Lydia, the seller of purple, a very successful businesswoman, and so on. So Luke is very positive on this. But look at verse 5. But the Jews were jealous, so they rounded up some bad characters from the marketplace and formed a mob and started a riot. They rushed to Jason's house in search of Paul and Silas in order to bring them out to the crowd. But they did not find them. They dragged Jason and other brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have caused trouble all over the world." Is that hyperbole or what? They've caused trouble all over the world, as we would say in Ireland, all over the world and several other places. And Jason has welcomed them into his house. Now, the focus is on Jason. Jason's local. Jason's the head of the synagogue. Jason has to continue to live in Thessalonica amongst these people. So whilst Paul and Silas are the targets, he's going to be collateral damage. He's going to have a tough time. Now, here's what they always said. This was the only reason the magistrates would be interested. Look at it carefully. They're all defying Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, one called Jesus. When they heard this, the crowd and the city officials were thrown into turmoil, and they made Jason and the others post bond and let them go. So here's a tough situation in Thessalonica, and there were prominent people who came to faith because of Paul's relatively short ministry in Thessalonica. I remember years ago, leading citizens, civic leaders, people like that, people who own a business always have an influence. I preached years ago in a church in Scotland in a lovely city called Bathgate. And in Bathgate, there was, in the Congregational church, there was a deacon who owned the biggest factory in Bathgate. It employed, at that stage, it employed about 80% of the men who lived in Bathgate. And he was a deacon in the Congregational church. And it became known in the city was, if you wanted a job at his factory, you better show up at his church on a Sunday morning. And if you did, then you got a job. You would approach him after the service, say, I was looking for a job. And he, well, go and show up in the morning, see my foreman at the front desk, and you got a job. That was how things worked in Bathgate. But here they are, being attacked, being under pressure, and poor Jason. Now, look, pick it up at verse 10. As soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea, and on arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now, let me just stop at that point. When you think about it, history generally is very kind to ancient Greek culture. But the more you examine the gods of the Greeks, the more you shake your heads. Because Zeus was a womanizing rapist, and their epic heroes in Greek culture were blood-stained, immoral monsters. But yet, from a distance, we look back, oh, the culture of Greece, the language of Greece, the language of theater and their gods and the legends and all the rest. The more you look at the legends, and I heard a lot about legends from the various guides. On every bus we had a guide, and he would tell us local legends and so on and that kind of thing, and you'd be saying to yourself, my goodness, what the things these people got up to. It's worse than Congress. Now, here is Paul, and he moves on to Berea. Now, the Bereans were a very, very different group of people. They were very open. They were very willing. They were willing to accept the teaching that Paul gave, and so on. They were people who were, they searched the scriptures. Now, if you go to Berea today, you will find that Paul is a big part of that city. And we were taken to this place right in the center of the city. And it's on quite a small street, but there's a sort of garden shrine, if you like, to Paul. And there's a statue of Paul, a bronze statue of Paul, life-size, in this garden. And all over, there are walls on this side, and then a shrine on this side, the statue of Paul. And it gives in Greek the passages from the New Testament where it talks about Paul and going to Berea and so on. It's fascinating. And right in the middle, they have 3 stone steps that they tell you were part of a staircase in a building. Steps up, there are 3 of them, and they kept them, and they're revered because Paul walked up and down these steps. And I reached out, I think it was this hand, and touched them. So if you want to shake that hand afterwards, for a mere $1, you can do that. But they really, I mean, when you go into Berea, it is a place where the signs about the Apostle Paul are everywhere. Of course, they're in Greek, directing you to where the shrine is and so on. But these people in Berea were Now you notice in verse 11, what does it say? It says they were of more noble character than the Thessalonians. Why does it say that? For they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. You see the difference? This first group said, no, that's nonsense. The man's talking nonsense. We don't accept this. But the Bereans said, well, now let's think about this. Let's follow this guy's argument. He's given us certain references in the Hebrew scriptures. Let's look at them. Let's look at them and say, well, do we accept what this guy Paul is saying? He's making this leap between this Jesus of Nazareth being the Messiah and what the Old Testament says that we can expect when the Messiah comes. One of the strongest things was that throughout, whenever the Messiah is mentioned, it tells you all kinds of things will happen. The Messiah will have special powers. The blind will be given back their sight. The lame will be able to walk. Even the dead will be raised. Does that sound familiar? So when Paul starts to explain the Gospels and gives incidents of Jesus going from village to village, town to town, healing people, helping people, blessing people, they begin to say, well, wait a minute, those are kind of some of the hallmarks of the Messiah. This is what we were told to expect. These were the authentication marks of the Messiah. And why I say that, it's very important that you understand that before Jesus and after Jesus, there were a parade of false messiahs. And those were people who claimed to be the Messiah and gathered a crowd and gathered supporters and had followers and so on. But ultimately, they overstretched themselves and they were proved to be false. One particular well-known one gathered his followers onto the Mount of Olives, and on one day he said, now if you look across to the wall of Jerusalem, at my word, in a few moments' time, the wall will completely collapse. So guess what happened? Well, it didn't collapse. And so that kind of, you're left thinking, I'm not sure this guy's the real deal here. And you begin to have his followers began to melt away. So there were a lot of false messiahs, and God in his wisdom knew that this was going to happen both before Jesus and after Jesus. And so there are in the scriptures these things to say, okay, the real Messiah will be able to do the following. And you can go through those. Now, this is the kind of thing that these Bereans said, well, let's examine it. Let's listen to what he has to say. Let's examine the passages that he's talking about. Let's consider it and so on. And see if what Paul said was true, as it says in verse 11. Many of the Jews believed. And here's Randy's famous group, favorite group, as did a number of prominent Greeks, women, and many Greek men. Now, do you notice what does he do? Who's he put first? Women. See what I'm saying about Luke? And when we go on a bit, you're going to see that Paul meets two people who have been thrown out of Rome, and it's Aquila and Priscilla. Now, Aquila is the husband. Priscilla is the wife. Who does Luke mention first? Priscilla. See, he's pushing the women forward. Now, no ancient writer does that. You mentioned the husband. The husband's the important one. He's the guy who makes the decisions. He's the guy you sell life insurance to. The wife is secondary. She bears children. She keeps the house. She doesn't make any decision. Her husband does that. But in several instances, and this is one of them, Luke talks about the women first. He talks about prominent women, important women, significant women. And there he mentions the Greek women first, and then many Greek men. Now, you could spend all day thinking about that and thinking about, it's always been my view and it's always been my experience that women are much more perceptive than men. Would you agree? Women are better readers of people than men. If 4 guys play golf and each of them goes home to his wife, and you say, well, what did you discover about Jack? The average guy, well, no idea. Don't know. You get 4 women together, they will know all about their children, their grandchildren, where they grew up, where they went to school, where they went to college. They could write a book. You see, women look beyond the surface. Guys are surface people. And if you go home after playing, you know, all you can tell your wife is, yeah, he beat me. Had a better score than me. Seriously, with women, there is an inbred perception, an understanding, an ability to look below the surface. Women are much better judges of people than men are. And these women are listening to Paul, they're looking at Paul, they're assessing Paul, they're deciding, is this guy on the level? Is he telling the truth? Is he a true preacher, teacher? Is he giving us the story? Or is he just here maybe going to fleece us for money? Now, verse 13, notice how far jealousy travels. You're about to see in verse 13. When the Jews in Thessalonica learned, and by the way, it's about 30-odd miles between Berea and Thessalonica. At least that was my impression on the bus. When the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, they went there, agitating the crowds and stirring them up, and the brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. The men who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him in Athens as soon as possible. So here was an encouraging light spot. Here was a period after punishment, beating, rough treatment in Philippi, then being run out of town in Thessalonica. He comes to Berea and he gets a fair hearing. And then Paul moves on then to Athens. Now remember, Athens was at this stage the second city of the world. First was Rome, second was Athens. And they are not terribly impressed. We've got to stop now, but they were not terribly impressed with Paul. And he sets out to convince the Athenians of the truth of what he's preaching. And we're going to look next time at how he does it, but I want to give you this quote. This is not a New Testament quote or a biblical quote. This is a quote from culture. And this will give you an idea what kind of place Athens was, and you can read about it in the closing verses of chapter 17. The quote was, it's easier in Athens to meet a god than it is to meet a man. It was a city that had statues by the hundreds, shrines by the dozen, temples by the score, to every god you could think of. So that's the kind of place. And the other thing is, it's a university town. So it's filled with people who already believe that they know everything. If you've ever spent any time in a university town, you quickly discover that. Professors are the hardest people to persuade of anything beyond their own particular subject. So we're going to pick it up at chapter 16, and we'll look at how Paul gets on amongst this highly intellectual, highly sophisticated Athenian culture as he presents the story of Jesus. Anyone got any questions? Remember, I always say to you, ask the questions when you think of them, because you probably will have forgotten them. Anybody? No? Okay, thank you so much, everybody. We'll pick it up at verse 16 next time as he goes to Athens.